Section 1, chapters 1 through 8 of The Three Sisters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. The Three Sisters by May Sinclair. Chapter 1. North of East, in the bottom, where the road drops from the high moor, is the village of Garth in Garthdale. It crouches there with a crook of the dale behind and before it, between half-shut doors of the west and south. Under the mystery and terror of its solitude it crouches, like a beaten thing, cowering from its topmost roof to the bowed back of its stone bridge. It is the last village up Garthdale, a handful of gray houses, old and small and humble. The high road casts them off, and they turn their backs to it in their fear and huddle together humbly down by the beck. Their stone roofs and walls are naked and blackened by wind and rain, as if fire had passed over them. They have the silence, the darkness, and the secrecy of all ultimate habitations. North, where the high road begins to rise again, the Vicarage stands all alone. It turns its face toward the village, old and gray and humble as any house there, and looks on the road sideways through the small shy window of its gable end. It has a strip of garden in front and on its farther side, and a strip of orchard at the back. The garden slopes down to the churchyard, and a lane leading to the pastures runs between. And all these things of stone, the village, the vicarage, the church, the churchyard, and the gravestones of the dead, are alike naked and black, blackened as if fire had passed over them; and in their grayness and their desolation they are one with each other and with the network of low walls that links them to the last solitary farm on the high moor. And on the breast of the earth they show, one moment, solid as if hewn out of her heart, and another, slender and wind blown as a tangle of gray thread on her green gown. Chapter 2. Through 4 of its 5 front windows the house gave back darkness to the dark. One, on the ground floor, showed a golden oblong, skirted with watery gray where the lamplight thinned the solid blackness of the wall. The 3 sisters, Mary, Gwendolen, and Alice, daughters of James Carteret, the Vicar of Garth, were sitting there in the dining room behind the yellow blind, doing nothing. In their supine, motionless attitudes they seemed to be waiting for something to happen so soon that if there had been anything to do it was not worth their while doing it. All 3 were alike in the small, broad faces that brooded, half sullen and half sad; in the wide eyes that watched vaguely; in the little tender noses, and in the mouths, tender and sullen too; in the arch and sweep of the upper lips, the delicate fullness of the lower; in the way of the thick hair, parted and turned back over the brows in 2 wide and shallow waves. Mary, the eldest, sat in a low chair by the fireside. Her hands were clasped loosely on the black woolen socks she had ceased to darn. She was staring into the fire with her gray eyes, the thick gray eyes that never let you know what she was thinking. The firelight woke the flame in her reddish tawny hair. The red of her lips was turned back and crushed against the white. Mary was shorter than her sisters, but she was the one that had the color, and with it she had a stillness that was not theirs. Mary's face brooded more deeply than their faces, but it was untroubled in its brooding. She had learned to darn socks for her own amusement on her 11th birthday, and she was 27 now. Alice, the youngest girl (she was 23), lay stretched out on the sofa. She departed in no way from her sister's type, but that her body was slender and small boned, that her face was lightly finished, that her gray eyes were clear and her lips pale against the honey white of her face, and that her hair was colorless as dust except where the edge of the wave showed a dull gold. Alice had spent the whole evening lying on the sofa, and now she raised her arms and bent them, pressing the backs of her hands against her eyes; and now she lowered them and lifted one sleeve of her thin blouse, and turned up the milk white under surface of her arm, and lay staring at it and feeling its smooth texture with her fingers. Gwendolen, the second sister, sat leaning over the table with her arms flung out on it, as they had tossed from her the book she had been reading. She was the tallest and the darkest of the three. Her face followed the type obscurely, and vividly and emphatically it left it. There was dusk in her honey whiteness, and dark blue in the gray of her eyes. The bridge of her nose and the arch of her upper lip were higher, lifted, as it were, in a decided and defiant manner of their own. About Gwenda there was something alert and impatient. Her very supineness was alive. It had distinction, the savage grace of a creature utterly abandoned to a sane fatigue. Gwenda had gone 15 miles over the moors that evening. She had run and walked and run again in the riotous energy of her youth. Now she was too tired to read. Gwenda was the first to speak. "Is it 10 yet?" "No." Mary smiled, but the word shuddered in her throat like a weary moan. "How long?" "43 minutes." "Oh, Lord." Gwenda laughed the laugh of brave nerves tortured. From her sofa beyond the table Alice sighed. At 10 o'clock Essy Gale, the maidservant, would come in from the kitchen and the Vicar from the inner room, and Essy would put the Bible and Prayer Book on the table and the Vicar would read prayers. That was all they were waiting for. It was all that could happen. It happened every night at 10 o'clock. III. Alice spoke next. "What day of the month is it?" "The 30th," Mary answered. "Then we've been here exactly 5 months to day." "That's nothing," said Mary, "to the months and years we shall be here." "I can't think what possessed Papa to come and bury us all in this rotten place." "Can't you?" Mary's eyes turned from their brooding. Her voice was very quiet, barely perceptible the significant stress. "Oh, if you mean it's me he wants to bury, you needn't rub that in." "I'm not rubbing it in." "You are. You're rubbing it in every time you look like that. That's the beastly part of it. Supposing he does want to get back on me, why should he go and punish you two?" "If he thinks he's punishing me, he's sold," said Gwenda. "He couldn't have stuck you in a rottener hole." Gwenda raised her head. "A hole? Why, there's no end to it. You can go for miles and miles without meeting anybody, unless some darling mountain sheep gets up and looks at you. It's a divine place, Ally." "Wait till you've been another 5 months in it. You'll be as sick as I am." "I don't think so. You haven't seen the moon get up over Greffington Edge. If you had, if you knew what this place was like, you wouldn't lie there grizzling. You wouldn't talk about punishing. You'd wonder what you'd done to be allowed to look at it, to live in it a day. Of course, I'm not going to let on to Papa that I'm in love with it." Mary smiled again. "It's all very well for you," she said. "As long as you've got a moor to walk on, you're all right." "Yes, I'm all right," Gwenda said. Her head had sunk again and rested in the hollow of her arms. Her voice, muffled in her sleeve, came soft and thick. It died for drowsiness. In the extreme immobility and stillness of the three, the still house stirred and became audible to them, as if it breathed. They heard the delicate fall of the ashes on the hearth, and the flame of the lamp jerking as the oil sputtered in the burnt wick. Their nerves shook to the creeping, crackling sounds that came from the wainscot, infinitely minute. A tongue of fire shot hissing from the coal. It seemed to them a violent and terrifying thing. The breath of the house passed over them in thick smells of earth and must, as the fire's heat sucked at its damp. The church clock struck the half hour. Once, twice, two dolorous notes that beat on the still house and died. Somewhere out at the back a door opened and shut, and it was as if the house drew in its breath at the shock of the sound. Presently a tremor crept through Gwenda's young body as her heart shook it. She rose and went to the window. IV. She was slow and rapt in her going, like one walking in her sleep, moved by some impulse profounder than her sleep. She pulled up the blind. The darkness was up against the house, thick and close to the pane. She threw open the window, and the night entered palpably like slow water, black and sweet and cool. From the unseen road came the noise of wheels, and of a horse that in trotting clanked forever one shoe against another. It was young Rowcliffe, the new doctor, driving over from Morthe to Upthorne on the Moor, where John Greatorex lay dying. The pale light of his lamp swept over the low garden wall. Suddenly the four hoofs screamed, grinding together in the slide of their halt. The doctor had jerked his horse up by the Vicarage gate. The door at the back opened and shut again, suddenly, sharply, as if in fear. A voice swung out like a mournful bell into the night. A dalesman's voice, such a voice as the lonely land fashions sometimes for its own delight, drawling and tender, hushed by the hills and charged with the infinite mysterious sadness of their beauty. It belonged to young Greatorex, and it came from the doorway of the Vicarage yard. "That you, Dr. Rawcliffe? I was just goin' up the road to see if you was comin'." "Of course I was coming." The new doctor was short and stern with young Greatorex. The two voices, the soft and the stern, spoke together for a moment, low, inaudible. Then young Greatorex's voice was heard again, and in its softness there was the furtive note of shame. "I just looked into Vicarage to leave word with Parson." The noise of the wheels and hoofs began again. The iron shoes clanked together and struck out the rhythm that the sisters knew. And with the first beat of it, and with the sound of the two voices in the road, life, secret and silent, stirred in their blood and nerves. It quivered like a hunting thing held on the leash. V. Their stillness, their immobility were now intense, and not one spoke a word to the other. All three of them were thinking. Mary thought, "Wednesday is his day. On Wednesday I will go into the village and see all my sick people. Then I shall see him. And he will see me. He will see that I am kind and sweet and womanly." She thought, "That is the sort of woman that a man wants." But she did not know what she was thinking. Gwenda thought, "I will go out onto the moor again. I don't care if I am late for prayers. He will see me when he drives back, and he will wonder who is that wild, strong girl who walks by herself on the moor at night and isn't afraid. He has seen me 3 times, and every time he has looked at me as if he wondered. In 5 minutes I shall go." She thought, for she knew what she was thinking, "I shall do nothing of the sort. I don't care whether he sees me or not. I don't care if I never see him again. I don't care." Alice thought, "I will make myself ill. So ill that they'll have to send for him. I shall see him that way." VI. Alice sat up. She was thinking another thought. "If Mr. Greatorex is dead, Dr. Rowcliffe won't stay long at Upthorne. He will come back soon. And he will have to call and leave word. He will come in and I shall see him." But if Mr. Greatorex wasn't dead? If Mr. Greatorex were a long time over his dying? Then he might be kept at Upthorne, perhaps till midnight, perhaps till morning. Then, even if he called to leave word, she would not see him. When she looked deep she found herself wondering how long Mr. Greatorex would be over his dying. If she had looked a little deeper she would have found herself hoping that Mr. Greatorex was already dead. If Mr. Greatorex was dead before he got to Upthorne he would come very soon, perhaps before prayer time. And he would be shown into the drawing room. Would he? Would Essy have the sense? No. Not unless the lamp was lit there. Essy wouldn't show him into a dark room. And Essy was stupid. She might have no sense. She might take him straight into the study and Papa would keep him there. Trust Papa. Alice got up from her sofa and left the room, moving with her weary grace and a little air of boredom and of unconcern. She was always most unconcerned when she was most intent. Outside, in the passage, she stood a moment listening. All the ways of the house gave upon the passage in a space so narrow that by stretching out one arm she could have touched both walls. With the door open anywhere the passage became a gully for the north wind. Now, with all doors shut, it was as if the breath of the house was being squeezed out there between closing walls. The passage, instead of dividing the house, drew it together tight. And this tightness was intolerable to Alice. She hated it. She hated the whole house. It was so built that there wasn't a corner in it where you could get away from Papa. His study had one door opening into the passage and one into the dining room. The window where he sat raked the garden on the far side. The window of his bedroom raked the front. Its door commanded the stairhead. He was aware of everything you did, of everything you didn't do. He could hear you in the dining room. He could hear you overhead. He could hear you going up and down stairs. He could positively hear you breathe, and he always knew whether you were in bed or not. She drew in her breath lest he should hear it now. At the far end of the passage, on the wall space between the staircase and the kitchen door, raised on a small bracket, a small tin lamp showed a thrifty flame. Under it, on a mahogany table flap, was a row of bedroom candlesticks with their matchboxes. Her progress to the table flap was stealthy. She exalted this business of lighting the drawing room lamp to a desperate, perilous adventure. The stone floor deadened her footsteps as she went. Her pale eyes, half sullen, half afraid, slewed round to the door of the study on her right. With a noiseless hand she secured her matches and her candle. With noiseless feet she slid into the darkness of the drawing room. She dared not light her candle out there in the passage. For the Vicar was full of gloom and of suspicion in the half hour before prayer time, and at the spurt of the match he might come out blustering and insist on knowing what she was doing and where she was going, whereas presently he would know, and he might be quiet as long as he was satisfied that she wasn't shirking prayers. Stealthily, with her air of desperate adventure, she lit the drawing room lamp. She shook out the puffs and frills of its yellow paper shade. Under its gaudy skirts the light was cruel to the cramped and shabby room, to the huddled furniture, to the tarnished gilt, the perishing tones of gray and amber. Alice set the lamp on the top of the cottage piano that stood slantwise in a side window beyond the fireplace. She had pulled back the muslin curtains and opened both windows wide, so that the room was now bared to the south and west. Then, with the abrupt and passionate gesture of desire deferred, she sat down at the little worn out Erard and began to play. Sitting there, with the open window behind her, she could be seen. And she knew that she could be seen from over the wall by anybody driving past in a high dog cart. And she played. She played the Chopin Grande Polonaise, or as much of it as her fingers, tempestuous and inexpert, could clutch and reach. She played neither with her hands nor with her brain, but with her temperament, febrile and frustrate, seeking its outlet in exultant and violent sound. She fell upon the Erard like some fierce and hungry thing, tearing from the forlorn, humble instrument a strange and savage food. She played, with incredible omissions, discords, and distortions, but she played. She flung out her music through the windows into the night as a signal and an appeal. She played on the little worn out Erard in ecstasy and expectation, as if something momentous hung upon her playing. There was joy and triumph and splendor in the Grande Polonaise. She felt them in her heart and nerves as a delicate, dangerous tremor, the almost intolerable oncoming of splendor, of triumph, and of joy. And as she played the excitement gathered. It swung in more and more vehement vibrations. It went warm and flooding through her brain like wine. All the life of her bloodless body swam there, poised and thinned, but urgent, aspiring to some great climax of the soul. VII. The whole house was full of the Chopin Grande Polonaise. It raged there like a demon. Tortured out of all knowledge, the Grande Polonaise screamed and writhed in its agony. It writhed through the windows, seeking its natural attenuation in the open air. It writhed through the shut house and was beaten back pitilessly by the roof and walls. To let it loose thus was Alice's defiance of the house and her revenge. Mary and Gwenda heard it in the dining room and set their mouths and braced themselves to bear it. The Vicar in his study behind the dining room heard it and scowled. Essy, the maidservant, heard it she heard it worse than anybody in her kitchen on the other side of the wall. Now and then, when the Polonaise screamed louder, Mary drew a hissing breath of pain through her locked teeth, and Gwenda grinned. Not that to Gwenda there was anything funny in the writhing and screaming of the Grande Polonaise. It was that she alone appreciated its vindictive quality. She admired the completeness, the audacity of Alice's revenge. But Essy, in her kitchen, made no effort to stand up to the Grande Polonaise. When it began she sat down and laid her arms on the kitchen table, and her head, muffled in her apron, on her arms, and cried. She couldn't have told you what the Polonaise was like or what it did to her. All that she could have said was that it went through and through her. She didn't know, Essy didn't, what had come over her. For whatever noise Miss Alice made she hadn't taken any notice, not at first. It was in the last 3 weeks that the Polonaise had found her out and had begun to go through and through her, till it was more than she could bear. But Essy, crying into her apron, wouldn't have lifted a finger to stop Miss Alice. "Poor lass," Essy said to herself. "She loves to play. And Vicar, he'll not hold out much longer. He'll put foot down 'fore she gets through." through the screaming of the Polonaise Essy listened for the opening of the study door. VIII. The study door did not open all at once. "Wisdom and patience, wisdom and patience," the Vicar kept on muttering as he scowled. Those were his watchwords in his dealings with his womenkind. The Vicar was making a prodigious effort to maintain what seemed to him his godlike serenity. He was unaware that he was trying to control at one and the same time his temper and his temperament. He was a man of middle height and squarish build, dark, pale skinned and blue eyed like his daughter Gwendolen. The Vicar's body stretched tight the seams of his black coat and kept up at 57 a false show of muscular energy. The Vicar's face had a subtle quality of deception. The austere nose, the lean cheekbones, the square cut mustache, and close clipped pointed beard, black, slightly grizzled, made it appear at a little distance the face of an ascetic. It approached, and the blue of the eyes, and the black of their dilated pupils, the stare of the nostrils, and the half hidden lines of the red mouth revealed its profound and secret sensuality. The interior that contained him was no less deceptive. Its book lined walls advertised him as the scholarly recluse that he was not. He had an eye to this effect. He had placed in prominent positions the books that he had inherited from his father, who had been a schoolmaster. You were caught at the very door by the thick red line of the Tudor classics, by the 11 volumes of the Becker's Plato, with notes, bound in Russia leather, side by side with Jowett's translations in cloth, by Sophocles and Dean Plumptre, the Odyssey and Butcher and Lang, by Aeschylus and Robert Browning. The Vicar had carried the illusion of scholarship so far as to hide his Aristophanes behind a little curtain, as if it contained for him an iniquitous temptation. Of his own accord, and with a deliberate intention to deceive, he had added the Early Fathers, Tillotson's Sermons, and Farrar's Life of Christ. On another shelf, rather less conspicuous, were some bound volumes of The Record, with the novels of Mrs. Henry Wood and Miss Marie Corelli. On the ledge of his bureau Blackwood's Magazine, uncut, lay ready to his hand. The Spectator, in process of skimming, was on his knees. The Standard, fairly gutted, was on the floor. There was no room for it anywhere else. For the Vicar's study was much too small for him. Sitting there, in an armchair and with his legs in the fender, he looked as if he had taken flight before the awful invasion of his furniture. His bookcases hemmed him in on 3 sides. His roll-top desk, advancing on him from the window, had driven and squeezed him into the armchair. His bureau, armed to the teeth, leaning from its ambush in the recess of the fireplace, threatened both the retreat and the left flank movement of the chair. The Vicar was neither tall nor powerful, but his study made him look like a giant imprisoned in a cell. The room was full of the smell of tobacco, of a smoldering coal fire, of old warm leather and damp walls, and of the heavy, virile odor of the Vicar. A brown felt carpet and thick serge curtains shut out the draught of the northeast window. On a September evening the Vicar was snug enough in his cell, and before the Grande Polonaise had burst in upon him he had been at peace with God and man. But when he heard those first exultant, challenging bars he scowled inimically. Not that he acknowledged them as a challenge. He was inclined rather to the manly course of ignoring the Grande Polonaise altogether. And not for a moment would he have admitted that there had been anything in his behavior that could be challenged or defied, least of all by his daughter Alice. To himself in his study Mr. Carteret appeared as the image of righteousness established in an impregnable place, whereas his daughter Alice was not at all in a position to challenge and defy. She had made a fool of herself. She knew it, he knew it, everybody knew it in the parish they had left 5 months ago. It had been the talk of the little southern seaside town. He thanked God that nobody knew it or was ever likely to know it here. For Alice's folly was not any ordinary folly. It was the kind that made the parish which was so aware of it uninhabitable to a sensitive vicar. He reflected that she would be clever if she made a fool of herself here. By his decisive action in removing her from that southern seaside town he had saved her from continuing her work. In order to do it he had ruined his prospects. He had thrown up a good living for a poor one, a living that might but for Alice it certainly would have led to preferment for a living that could lead to nothing at all, a living where he could make himself felt for a living where there was nobody to feel him. And having done it he was profoundly sorry for himself. So far as Mr. Carteret could see there had been nothing else to do. If it had all to be done over again he told himself that he would do it. But there Mr. Carteret was wrong. He couldn't have done it or anything like it twice. It was one of those deeds, supremely sacrificial, that strain a man's moral energies to breaking point and render him incapable of further sacrifice, if, indeed, it did not render further sacrifice superfluous. Mr. Carteret honestly felt that even an exacting deity could require no more of him. And it wasn't the first time either, nor his daughter Alice the first woman who had come between the Vicar and his prospects. Looking back he saw himself driven from pillar to post, from parish to parish, by the folly or incompetence of his womankind. Strictly speaking, it was his first wife, Mary Gwendolen, the one the children called mother, who had begun it. She had made his first parish unendurable to him by dying in it. This she had done when Alice was born, thereby making Alice unendurable to him too. Poor Mamie. She always thought of her as having inscrutably failed him. All three of them had failed him. His second wife, Frances, the one the children called Mamma (the Vicar had made himself believe that he had married her solely on their account), had turned into a nervous invalid on his hands before she died of that obscure internal trouble which he had so wisely and patiently ignored. His third wife, Robina, the one they called Mummy, had run away from him in the 5th year of their marriage. When she implored him to divorce her he said that, whatever her conduct had been, that course was impossible to him as a churchman, as she well knew, but that he forgave her. He had made himself believe it. And all the time he was aware, without admitting it, that if the thing came into court, Robina's evidence might be a little damaging to the appearances of wisdom and patience, of austerity and dignity which he had preserved so well. He had had an unacknowledged vision of Robina standing in the witness box, very small and shy, with her eyes fluttering, while she explained to the gentlemen of the jury that she ran away from her husband because she was afraid of him. He could hear the question, "Why were you afraid?" and Robina's answer, but at that point he always reminded himself that it was as a churchman that he objected to divorce. For his profession had committed him to a pose. He had posed for more than 30 years to his parish, to his 3 wives, to his 3 children, and to himself, till he had become unconscious of his real thoughts, his real motives, his real likings and dislikings. So that when he told himself that it would have been better if his third wife had died, he thought he meant that it would have been better for her and for his opinion of her, whereas what he really did mean was that it would have been better for himself. For if Robina had died he could have married again. As it was, her infidelity condemned him to a celibacy for which, as she knew, he was utterly unsuited. Therefore he thought of her as a cruel and unscrupulous woman, and when he thought of her he became more sorry for himself than ever. Now, oddly enough, the Grande Polonaise had set Mr. Carteret thinking of Robina. It was not that Robina had ever played it. Robina did not play. It was not the discords introduced into it by Alice, though Robina had been a thing of discords. It was that something in him, obscurely but intimately associated with Robina, responded to that sensual and infernal tremor that Alice was wringing out of the Polonaise. So that, without clearly knowing why it was abominable, Mr. Carteret said to himself that the tune Alice was playing was an abominable tune and must be stopped at once. He went into the drawing room to stop it. And Essy in the kitchen raised her head and dried her eyes on her apron. "If you must make a noise," said Mr. Carteret, "be good enough to make one that is less disturbing." He stood in the doorway staring at his daughter Alice. Her excitement had missed by a hair's breadth the spiritual climax. It had held itself in for one unspeakable moment, then surged, crowding the courses of her nerves. Beaten back by the frenzy of the Polonaise, it made a violent return. It rose, quivering, at her eyelids and her mouth. It broke, and with a shudder of all her body, split itself and fell. The Vicar stared. He opened his mouth to say something and said nothing. Finally he went out muttering, "Wisdom and patience, wisdom and patience." It was a prayer. Alice trailed to the window and leaned out, listening for the sound of hoofs and wheels. Nothing there but the darkness and stillness of the moors. She trailed back to the Erard and began to play again. This time it was Beethoven, the Pathetic Sonata. End of Project Gutenberg, Expatriate in Bangor, Maine